100,000 Asian women were forced into sexual slavery in a wave of prostitution never seen before. Vietnam, Taiwan, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Korea were the countries where these comfort women, also known as Ianfu, came from. The Japanese, completely unrestrained, mercilessly attacked thousands of innocent women and even children. Not one escaped the horror. However, we cannot ignore the most heinous war crimes of the Allies. German women preferred to kill their daughters and then commit suicide rather than be raped by Soviet soldiers. That was how humiliating the situation was for those defeated by the war.
Jedenfalls, das kam und ging. Das sind viele, die hintereinander gekommen sind.
Pigs, they let me be raped twice in a row and left me lying there like garbage, said the anonymous author of the diary, a woman in Berlin, whose identity you will learn in this video.
Da ist man wie tot. Der ganze Körper ist wie verkrampft. Ekel empfindet man da. Ekel. Ich kann mich nicht anders ausdrücken. Das war doch alles gegen unseren Willen. Wir waren ja freiwillig für die. Das ging am Laufenden. Ich kann nicht sagen, 10, 15.
They were boys who had fought thousands of kilometers risking their lives. They had the right to have a good time with a woman. These words were spoken by none other than Joseph Stalin. The leader of the Soviet Union, far from punishing his men for the brutal mistreatment inflicted during the capture of Berlin, justified these atrocities. In fact, Stalin made clear the side he had taken in a long-standing discussion. Within the Red Army, there were voices that condemned rape, such as that of Marshal Rokossovsky, who published a list of sanctions for soldiers who committed such crimes. His aim was to appease feelings of hatred towards the enemy during battle. However, brutality was inevitable because discipline was non-existent. Even General Okorakov, head of the Department of the Second Belarusian Front, opposed Rokossovsky's rules during a meeting of senior Soviet commanders, considering that it was a denial of the right to revenge. The Russians had suffered too much from the Nazi advance on their territory. The brutality and all the bloodshed fueled strong sentiment, reinforced by propaganda campaigns against the Germans calling for no mercy. Now they felt it was their turn, and defenseless women were the means to get their cruel revenge.
Dann kamen Russen und haben mich immer beleuchtet mit Taschenlampen, nicht, oder was sie da hatten. Und dann kam einer und sagt, Frau, jetzt bekommst du ein Quartier. Und das Quartier waren Luftschutzbunker und in dem stand ein Tisch drin und in der Nacht kam ein Russe nach dem anderen und alle haben mich da auf dem Tisch vorgenommen.
Although the Soviets' main objective was the death of the enemy, at every step they took towards Berlin, they perpetrated countless other brutal crimes. It is no secret that the most common ones were related to sexual violence, and the records of a soldier gave an account of this. Vladimir Gelfand was a young Ukrainian who held the position of lieutenant within the Red Army. Although it was not allowed to document anything that would compromise the Russians, he secretly kept a diary in which he wrote about his experiences of the war. Many of its pages were devoted to the ferocious abuse of women, offering an explanation for the large number of them who preferred death to being caught by those who supposedly came to free them from Hitler's regime. One of the most horrifying experiences was what happened on the banks of the Spree River. There, Gelfand came across a group of several German women loaded with suitcases. When the man saw their faces, he noticed that the pain was undisguisable. Their faces bore the trauma of having been savagely abused, and their suitcases bore the sad weight of humiliation. When Gelfand asked them what was happening, they replied that they had been raped by Soviet troops. They raped me all night. Some were old and others still had acne. They all climbed on top of me. They stood in line. I lost count, but there were no less than 20 men. Testimonies like this abound among women who were in the German capital during that period. Efforts to escape terror often came down to recurrent suffering, as this other victim recounts.
Das sind viele, die hintereinander gekommen sind. Die haben nichts. Einer weiß ich, der wollte auch, ich soll mich hinlegen, und dann sagte er, wie viele Kameraden sind schon da gewesen? Ziehen Sie sich an.
In addition to the Ukrainian soldier's diary, another diary was published after the war, which recorded the sadistic events that occurred in the German capital between April 20th and June 22nd, 1945. The book was published under the name A Woman in Berlin. It was an anonymous first-person account of the cruelty of those days. One of them pulls my wrists, making me move forward along the corridor. Now the other one pulls me, putting his hand on my throat so that I can no longer scream for fear of being strangled. The tension can be felt at every moment of the story. The victim is aware that there is no victorious way out of this scene. She can suffer a rape that will probably leave her with lifelong scars, or she can resist and die in the worst possible way.
Und dann kam ein Russe und dann, Frau, komm mit. Und wir haben gesagt, nein, wir gehen nicht mit. Und dann hat er sich die Tochter von meiner Schwester Schwiegermutter, also die Schwägerin, genommen und ist mit der rausgegangen. Da muss ja da noch ein kleiner Stall gewesen sein. Jedenfalls hörten wir bloß 3 Schüsse. Dann kam er zurück und dann haben wir ihn gefragt, ja, hat totgeschossen, nicht? Da hat sie sich wohl widersetzt.
The work was published anonymously, but in 2003 it was revealed that the author was a German journalist named Marta Hillers, who recounted the barbarity from her own experience and added stories from other victims. It has nearly 300 pages that portray the pain of dark times, and no one was deprived of the horrifying spectacle that was offered everywhere. Sometimes the survival instinct against the packs of savage soldiers caused the rest of the men to remain motionless in front of the hunt for a poor, defenseless woman. They tried to stay silent and look the other way while the atrocities occurred. Pigs! They let me be raped twice in a row and left me lying there like garbage. The victims soon understood that they were alone. Nothing and no one would rescue them from that hell of suffering and blood in which they were trapped by violent mistreatment.
Mich widersetzt und dann hat er mich geschlagen mit dem Gewehrkolben auf den Kopf. Und dann dachte ich, nun musste ja ohnmächtig werden. Ich wurde aber nicht ohnmächtig. Dann habe ich mich so gestellt, als wenn ich ohnmächtig bin. Und die ganze Zeit gelegen, hat er mein Herz abgehorcht. Hat er darauf gehorcht, ob ich noch lebe. Und dann hat er mir die Hose aufgeschnitten, alle Sachen aufgeschnitten und hat mich vergewaltigt.
Revenge, devoid of all humanity, provoked different reactions in women seeking to avoid the deepest pain. Soldiers often encountered victims who were open to being abused by a man, but in exchange for his protection from others. You can sleep with me, do whatever you want with me, but only you. Finding refuge by surrendering to a single abuser was to minimize the evil, but those who were not willing to bend had to be resourceful. Prey to horror soon learned to disappear during hunting hours. Young daughters remained hidden in attics for days on end. Adult women went out to fetch water only early in the morning, when Soviet soldiers slept off the previous night's alcohol. As another alternative to escape all violence, some would dirty their faces and try to deform them as they walked down the road dressed in rags, hiding their entire body from head to toe and limping. Sometimes, they would even cover their skin with red spots to simulate typhus. Any trick that would increase the chances of frightening off their attackers was valid. Often, the greatest danger came from a mother who revealed the hiding place of other girls in a desperate attempt to save her own. Then, they were limited to hearing the pitiful moans of those victims who that night had not been so lucky to avoid their predators. However, women were not the only ones who designed tactics to achieve their goal. Soldiers learned to get what they wanted by taking advantage of the chaos of war. Hunger was one of the main miseries, and the troops turned something as small as a chocolate into currency to get sex. The high command of the Red Army was complacent with these aberrations. There were no orders, but neither were there punishments nor will to interrupt the chain of atrocities. The slogan was clear: revenge. Berlin became a hunting ground for all women, regardless of age. Soviet soldiers dedicated themselves to raping them under any circumstances. Teenagers, adults, elderly, strong or sick women were subjected by the combatants. From 12-year-old girls to 70-year-old women suffered equally, and more than 10,000 of them ended up dying as a result of these events, either directly from the aggressions received, from complications with abortions after fathering children with their abusers, or by suicide. If we talk about numbers, only between June 1945 and the beginning of 1946, there were 995 requests for abortions in one of the districts of Berlin. The archives have handwritten reports denouncing rapes in the living room of their houses in front of their parents. But the true number of victims will probably never be known. The research of the German historian Miriam Gebhardt estimates that there were 860,000 mass rapes at the end of the war. She also said that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This attitude responds to another behavior that existed in the face of brutal crimes. Many women tried to appeal to the compassion of the commanders, coming forward to say that the men in their battalion had attacked them. They showed their torn private parts, their underwear stained red with blood, and in the worst cases they showed how their friends or relatives lay naked on the ground mutilated. However, the soldiers turned a deaf ear, and that led to the victims beginning to remain silent. An example of this is the case of Ingeborg Bullert. 2 soldiers raped me. I thought they would kill me, the victim recalled, after more than 60 years of silence. In 2008, driven by the release of the film based on her book Woman in Berlin, she decided to tell her story, which she had kept quiet for so long out of shame. My mother liked to boast that her daughter had not been traded, she said. But her mother was wrong. Young Ingeborg had been marked for life when she was found hiding in a shelter in the German capital. However, the silence of the atrocities was not something exclusive to the struggle between the Soviets and the Germans. An event as significant as the Normandy landing in France also had its dark side.
On avait des bribes de l'histoire, mais des incertitudes. Ma mère, qui avait à l'époque 17 ans, a été violée par un Américain, un soldat américain qui était noir, et à l'intérieur de la maison. Et sur les entrefaits, donc, mon grand-père est descendu pour voir ce qui se passait, et il a été tué à bout portant derrière la porte de cette maison, en fait.
A similar case to Bullert's came to light 80 years after the Great Assault on the French coast. In this case, the one who told the story was Amy Dupré, the daughter of the victim. A week after D-Day, 2 American soldiers arrived at the door of her home looking for a woman. They presented themselves as the Great Liberators. They were drunk, and they would not take no for an answer. Suddenly, they pointed their guns and fired in the direction of Amy's father, although they did not hit him. Then they approached the young woman, but her mother intervened. She was willing to sacrifice herself to protect her family.
Ils l'ont emmené vers la Joulière, dans un pré. Et là, ils l'ont violée comme ils l'ont voulu, qu'avec des fusils toujours pointés sur elle. Elle a souffert. Maman a souffert. Moi aussi par la suite, parce que tous les jours, je pense pour moi.
The events of that night were not isolated. In October 1944, after winning the Battle of Normandy, American military authorities tried 152 soldiers for raping French women. In fact, hundreds or even thousands of rapes are known to have occurred between that year and the soldiers' departure in 1946, but not all of them were reported. They may not have been as vicious as the Soviets, who carried out abuses on 10 or 12 soldiers at a time, but the American crimes left the same painful and deep scars. However, not all abuse and rape were restricted to the European continent. We are talking about the comfort centers, where thousands of so-called comfort women or ianfu were locked away. Most of them were girls, who were forced to serve for years as sexual slaves for the infamous Imperial Japanese Army. This heinous crime began long before the other two. Its origins take us back to the Nanking Massacre in China, between late 1937 and early 1938. Japanese soldiers raped and murdered some 50,000 women during their attacks on the city, and established centers where many others were forced to remain. Over the years, the forces that joined the Axis in the World War repeated these practices on all the fronts where they fought. It is estimated that there were approximately 200,000 victims who were subjected to forced prostitution, whose common denominator was endless physical and spiritual pain, suffering brutal punishments.
Ginagawa nila sa amin yan. Kaya yung kapatid kong isa, nasiraan ng ulo. Kasi hindi lang naman ni isa mangre-rape sa iyo eh. Dalawa, tatlo.
Prostitution centers were established in China, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, and the Philippines, among many other places, and were filled with young girls between the ages of 12 and 20. The Japanese abused them day after day, until the victims felt broken, as if their fragile bodies no longer belonged to them, and the torture never ended. They remained the unfortunate subjects of savage mass rapes until the final days of World War II.
November 23, 1944, itong Mapaniki, binomba ng mga sundalong Hapon. Maraming tinamaan ng bagsak ng mortal at ninakuinan yun.
Yung kamay na gano'n. Saka kinuha ako ng Hapon, sinalakay ako. Nang magising ako, natulog ako kanwari, natulog ako sa sakit ng dinamdam ko. Nang luray-luray ang aking katawan, nakita ko may dugo ang aking damit sa ilalim.
Brothels for forced prostitution were set up in hotels, clubs, and even camouflaged in an airfield. This was the case in KlLLED, Indonesia, where due to the high mortality rate caused by malaria in the country, each Japanese soldier received a manual entitled Pocketbook of Hygiene in Tropical Areas. It explained how best to avoid getting sick when having sex with a prostitute. There, the imperial troops were fascinated by the exotic Dutch women who lived there. Many of them were blonde and blue-eyed, which led to special treatment. They received better care, with abundant food and hot baths. However, these were exceptions to the rule, as recounted by Korean Lee Ok-seon.
군인 할라데 40명 내지 50명. 24시간 동안에 40명, 50명 어떻게 그걸 죽여야 되지?
This woman spent her life in one of the brothels, living in inhumane conditions. They were not a place for humans, they were a slaughterhouse. And she was responsible for making some of the worst atrocities known.
애기 낳아서 길리는 사람 구멍물에 끌고 가라 또 거꾸로 물에 갖다 엮고 안 되고가봐 술탄 그것도 근처에서 치료를 한 거야. 이 양반도 그래서 해끌고 한 3년.
At the end of the war, that terrifying chapter of history was one of those judged by the courts in the Tokyo trial, although it is estimated that there were around 200,000 women condemned to these horrors. To this day, the exact number of victims is still unknown. In the absence of precision, entire countries that suffered the atrocities of the Japanese Empire are still waiting for an apology. Now, after having learned everything about the worst violations of World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for accompanying us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.